All right, so we're diving deep today. We're going exploring this really interesting collection of poems. It's called Sonyu Sunset, and it's by this Korean poet, Kim Jong-san. And it's really cool because it mixes these like traditional Korean poetry styles with all this vivid imagery of nature.
Yeah, it's really striking. You get this sense of place right away, and it's tied to these deeper themes.
Exactly. It's not just describing pretty landscapes.
Mm.
And then on top of that, we've got this whole other layer because he's really committed to using these native Korean words, what they call awo.
Right, and having both the original Korean and the English translation side by side, it's a really unique way to experience the poetry. You can see how the translator has tried to capture not just the meaning, but the feeling.
Yeah, the essence of it, right.
Right.
So for part one, we're calling it Nature's Canvas because nature is like this central character, I guess you could say, in Jongseon's work. Lots of ocean imagery, islands, birds. It's almost like he's using nature as a language.
Absolutely, and it's not just about beauty or serenity. There's this underlying tension, a sense of unease that runs through a lot of the poems. Take the title poem, Seonyu Sunset, for instance.
Yeah, just reading those words, saying "New Sunset," you kind of picture this peaceful scene, right? The sun dipping below the horizon, all these warm colors.
Yeah.
But then you get to the actual lines. Mangjubong waits for its lover. A deep longing dyed gold, the sound of waves growing distant, a seagull being assassinated, a sea that thirsts for blood. I mean, whoa, that takes a dark turn.
Doesn't it? And that contrasts the beauty of the sunset against this violence, this sense of loss. It creates this feeling of, well, almost dread.
Yeah, it's like there's something lurking beneath the surface of this beautiful scene.
And that feeling's even more intense when you know the history behind it. You see, Mangjubong is the peak of Seonyu Island, which was actually submerged when they built a dam on the Han River back in 1968. So only the peak is still visible. Everything else is underwater.
Wow, so that sense of loss in the poem, it's literally tied to the landscape itself.
Exactly, and it's interesting because this poem's written in a traditional Korean form called sijo. It's got this specific three-line structure with a certain syllable count for each line. It's meant to evoke a certain mood, you know.
The kind of reflective, contemplative mood, right?
Exactly. So you've got this historical loss woven into the imagery, framed by this traditional form that emphasizes reflection and emotion. It adds a whole other layer to how we understand Seonyu sunset.
It's like these poems are doing so much more than just describing a scene. They're telling a story. They're exploring these deep emotions.
And you see similar themes echoed in other poems throughout the collection, too. Like in Seoul Island, for example, he describes the West Sea as mother's lullaby, which initially sounds comforting, but
Yeah, you think lullaby, you think soothing, gentle.
But there's this underlying sense of fragility, too, a reminder of nature's power. Or take the dance of an albatross, this image of the albatross soaring over this empty space of the sky. It speaks to freedom, but also to isolation, kind of mirroring our own human experience within this vastness.
Yeah, it's like he's drawing these parallels between us and nature, using these images to reflect our own emotions, our own anxieties.
Exactly, and this connection to nature runs even deeper when we start to consider Zhongxiang's relationship with language, his commitment to these ayo, or words. That's where we'll head next as we move into language and identity. But I'm curious, what struck you the most so far about Zhongxiang's use of nature imagery?
You know, I think it's that tension he creates, that blend of beauty and violence. It makes you look beyond the surface, you know, consider what might be hidden beneath. And I think that's where his unique use of language comes in. It adds this whole other layer of depth and nuance to what's already a really powerful image.
Yeah, that's it. That tension between beauty and something, I don't know, unsettling. It makes you think. And his use of language, that definitely plays a part.
Which is the perfect bridge to part two, language and identity. We talked about Jong-san's love for those native Korean words. The, what are they called?
The arse.
Right, the yajigigai. And he even gives us a glossary at the end of the book to help us navigate them.
Yeah, more than just a glossary, really. It's like a statement, you know? It shows how much he believes these words hold the true spirit of the Korean people.
It's beautiful, yeah. But it makes you think about how much we're really grasping, you know, when we're reading these poems in translation. Is something lost?
That's a tough question. Translation is always like walking a tightrope, trying to bridge cultures, but also interpret. And inevitably, there are things you just can't quite capture in another language. Those subtle shades of meaning, wordplay, cultural references that might not have a direct equivalent.
So are we missing out on the essence of Zhang Xian's poetry if we're not reading it in the original Korean.
I wouldn't say missing out, maybe experiencing it through a different lens. It's like we're peeking into another world, another way of thinking and feeling, even if we don't get every single nuance.
A glimpse into something new.
Yeah.
I like that.
And to help us navigate this linguistic landscape, maybe we should look at some of these fascinating Ayong words. Like one he uses a lot is chaka. It's usually translated as lovely or beautiful, but
I remember seeing that one in the glossary.
yeah, and it's a beautiful word even just to say, but it goes deeper. It's like a heart-stirring kind of beauty, something that evokes awe, wonder, more than just lovely, you know?
Almost like a deeper resonance.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder, does having a word for that specific feeling, does it change how you experience the world?
That's a great point. I mean, language, it's not just reflecting reality, is it? It shapes it, how we see things, how we express ourselves. So for Yongsan, using these native words, it's like a reclaiming of that power, ensuring those nuances aren't lost.
It's about keeping them alive.
Yeah.
And another one that really struck me was Sontuda, usually translated as renewal or regeneration, but
Oh, that's a powerful one. Literally, it means the power of the seed coming back to life.
it's an image, isn't it? Not just an abstract idea.
Exactly. And it reminds me of those themes we discussed earlier, that tension, that unease. It's like he's acknowledging the darkness, but pointing towards hope.
A new beginning. And it all ties back to that connection to nature, that cycle of life and death we were talking about.
Absolutely. And that's a perfect segue into part 3, Beyond Description, where we'll really dive into the heart of Zhongsan's philosophical ideas.
That idea of renewal, of starting over, it's powerful. And it feels like a good starting point for this part, Beyond Description, where we really dig into what Zhongsan is saying about life, death, all of it.
Right, because as we've seen, it's not just pretty words and images. He's wrestling with some big ideas here.
It's like he's using those images, those words, to help us make sense of it all.
Exactly. And a great example of that is the poem A Life.
Yeah.
It uses this image of a decaying pumpkin. You know, at first you might wonder, why a pumpkin? But that's where the power of symbolism comes in.
Because it's not about the pumpkin itself, right?
Yeah.
It's about what it represents.
Exactly. The pumpkin, it was once vibrant, full of life. But now it's withering, going back to the earth. And it's like a metaphor for how everything eventually decays. But it's not presented as a sad thing. There's beauty in it, too.
It's like he's saying death isn't the end, it's just a change.
Right.
Part of the cycle.
Right. And this connects to a lot of Eastern philosophies, especially Buddhism, the idea of impermanence, that everything is constantly changing, nothing stays the same.
It's a big shift from how we often think about things, you know?
Yeah.
Trying to hold on to things, denying that change is coming.
It is. And Zhongsan takes this idea even further in another poem, Fragrant Ship, it's called.
Okay, yeah, that one definitely got my attention. How does that fit into all this? I mean, it's about, well,
I know, right? But that's what's so brilliant about it. He takes something we usually find repulsive, something we avoid, and turns it into something beautiful.
so like he's flipping things on their head, making us see things differently.
Exactly. The poem talks about how this waste, this thing we might think of as disgusting, it becomes fertilizer. It helps new life grow.
So nothing is truly wasted. Even in death, there's this renewal.
And it highlights this interconnectedness, too, that everything is part of this bigger picture, a delicate balance. And it's not just about the natural world either. This connection extends to our relationships, our ancestors, everything.
So it's like Zhongsan is using these poems to open our eyes to the world around us.
Yeah, and to challenge us,
Yeah.
you know, to look deeper, think differently about things we might take for granted.
To find beauty in unexpected places.
Exactly. And I think that's a big part of what poetry does, isn't it? It opens up new ways of understanding ourselves, the world.
And in this case, it's like we're bridging cultures too, experiencing a whole different poetic tradition. So as we wrap up this deep dive into As I Use Sunset, what's the one thing you hope our listener takes away from all this?
I'd say it's don't be afraid to explore. You know, art, literature from different cultures, it can really challenge you, expand your horizons.
And you might even learn something about yourself along the way. And that's what we're all about here on The Deep Dive, exploring, learning, and hopefully sparking some curiosity in our listeners. So if this conversation about Sanyu Sunset has piqued your interest, why not check out some more of Zhongsan's work? Or maybe even dive into the world of Korean literature as a whole. There's a whole universe of beauty and knowledge waiting to be discovered.